October 16, 2014, was supposed to mark a new beginning. A young soldier returned home, reuniting with his wife after time apart, a moment most families imagine with relief, warmth, and quiet joy. But within hours, that reunion turned into something unthinkable. His wife was found dead, shot inside their home. At first, the explanation seemed almost too simple for something so devastating. It was called an accident. The husband claimed the shooting was unintentional, a tragic mistake involving a firearm. In the immediate aftermath, that version of events offered a way to process what had happened. Accidents, though painful, are easier to accept than something deliberate. But very quickly, doubts began to surface. Investigators noticed small inconsistencies, details that didn't fully align with the idea of an accidental discharge. It wasn't one single piece of evidence, but rather a pattern of questions that didn't have clear answers. The more closely they looked, the less straightforward the situation appeared. Attention then shifted to the relationship itself. What had been happening before that day? Because behind closed doors, relationships can carry tensions that aren't always visible from the outside. Prosecutors began to build a different narrative, one that suggested this wasn't a random mistake, but a result of deeper issues, possibly involving jealousy or conflict. According to them, the shooting was not accidental at all. Instead, they argued it was a violent act, something that may have been fueled by emotion, but still intentional. That claim stood in direct contrast to the husband's version of events, creating a sharp divide in how the case was understood. And that's where the real complexity lies. Because cases like this rarely come with a clear, undeniable answer. They are built piece by piece, through forensic evidence, timelines, and the consistency of each account. Investigators must determine whether the physical evidence supports an accident or contradicts it. Whether the story remains stable under scrutiny, or begins to shift. In the end, everything comes down to one critical question. Was this truly a tragic mistake, an irreversible moment of carelessness? Or was it something more? Because the answer doesn't just determine guilt or innocence, it defines how this story is remembered. As a heartbreaking accident, or as something far more deliberate, hidden beneath a version of events that, at first glance, seemed believable. Danielle Nemitz's story begins long before the night that would ultimately define how the world came to know her. She was, by all accounts, a resilient young woman, someone shaped not by ease, but by loss. At just 2 years old, she lost her mother. It's the kind of absence that doesn't fully register in the moment, but leaves a quiet imprint that follows a child into adulthood. Then, at 14, she lost her grandmother, the person who had stepped in, who had provided a sense of stability when everything else felt uncertain. With that loss, Danielle was left navigating life with a deep, unspoken need for something steady. Something reliable. Something that felt like home. That longing, for love, for belonging, for security, would influence the choices she made in the years that followed. At 17, she met Danielle Nemitz online. He was everything she believed she needed at that moment in her life. A soldier. Confident, structured, protective. He represented stability in a way that felt both reassuring and immediate. For someone who had grown up with so much unpredictability, that kind of presence can feel like an answer, a solution to questions that have lingered for years. Their relationship moved quickly. What began as connection soon turned into commitment. Marriage followed, along with the decision to build a life together, often across different states due to his military obligations. From the outside, it looked like momentum. Two young people starting fresh, creating something of their own. But when relationships move that fast, there's often little time to fully understand what's beneath the surface. And slowly, that surface began to shift. What once felt like protection began to take on a different tone. Skylar's behavior grew more controlling, more restrictive. It wasn't always obvious at first. Control rarely is. It can begin with small suggestions, subtle preferences, quiet expectations. But over time, those moments accumulate. Danielle's social life became limited. Her interactions were monitored. Decisions that once felt like hers alone were now influenced, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly. Isolation doesn't always happen all at once. It builds gradually, often without a clear moment where everything changes. Friends began to notice the difference. Danielle, once described as vibrant and expressive, seemed quieter. More reserved. The kind of change that isn't dramatic enough to immediately alarm, but noticeable enough to raise concern. The smiles became less frequent. The energy she once carried seemed muted. And beneath it, there was something harder to define, a sense of unease, of tension that didn't quite have a name. Still, life moved forward. And then came October 16, 2014. Skylar was returning home after being away for weeks. For many couples, that kind of reunion carries a sense of renewal, a chance to reconnect, to reset, to move forward. Danielle seemed to approach it that way. She prepared for his arrival carefully. Thoughtfully. There were candles, dinner, small details that suggested hope. A fresh start. Whatever difficulties had existed before, this was a moment to put them aside. At least, that's how it appeared. Because just hours later, everything changed. The life Danielle had been trying to create, the stability she had searched for since childhood, was gone. What remained was a scene that would raise immediate questions, followed by a narrative that would quickly become contested. What happened in those hours between his return and that single gunshot? That is where the story begins to fracture. On the surface, it could be framed as a reunion gone wrong. A moment that escalated unexpectedly. But when placed against the backdrop of everything that came before, the control, the isolation, the subtle shifts in behavior, the situation becomes more complex. Because moments like this rarely exist in isolation. They are often the result of patterns, of dynamics that have been forming over time. Danielle's life, in many ways, was defined by her search for stability. From early loss to young adulthood, she was looking for something constant, something she could rely on. And when she found Skylar, it seemed, at first, like she had found it. But stability, when built on control, is not truly stable. It's conditional. Fragile. Dependent on maintaining a certain balance, one that can shift without warning. And when it does, the consequences can be profound. Friends would later reflect on the changes they saw in her. The gradual withdrawal. The sense that something wasn't quite right, even if they couldn't fully articulate it at the time. Those observations, in hindsight, take on a different weight. Because they suggest that what happened on October 16 was not entirely disconnected from what came before. It was, perhaps, the final moment in a much longer story. A story that began with loss, moved through hope, and ended in a way no one could have predicted, but one that, in retrospect, raises difficult questions about warning signs, about control, and about how easily those dynamics can be overlooked until it's too late. And at the center of it all is Danielle. A young woman who spent her life searching for something steady, something safe, only to find herself in a situation where that sense of safety slowly slipped away. Until, in a single moment, it was gone entirely. The moment the gunshot rang out, it shattered more than just the silence inside that apartment, it set off a chain of events that would quickly unravel the story being told. A neighbor, startled and alarmed, didn't hesitate. They called 911. It was a single, decisive action, but one that ensured this wouldn't remain a private tragedy hidden behind closed doors. When officers arrived, they stepped into a scene that immediately carried weight. Danielle Nemitz was lying there, lifeless, a gunshot wound to her head. It was sudden, final, and impossible to ignore. Nearby was Skylar Nemitz, her husband, visibly emotional, appearing distraught in a way that, at first glance, seemed consistent with someone who had just witnessed something devastating. And he had an explanation ready. It was an accident, he told them. Then, more specifically, she shot herself. In the earliest moments of any investigation, those first statements matter. They often set the tone, shape the direction, and provide a framework for understanding what happened. But in this case, that framework didn't hold for long. Because almost immediately, something felt off. It wasn't just what Skylar said, it was how things began to shift as questions followed. His story, initially clear, started to change. First, he insisted Danielle had pulled the trigger herself. Then, under further questioning, that detail shifted. Now he admitted he had been holding the rifle. And then, another adjustment, it just went off. Each version moved further away from the last. And with every change, the certainty of an accident became harder to accept at face value. Investigators turned their attention to the physical scene, because while statements can change, evidence often doesn't. What they found added to the growing sense that something wasn't right. The rifle wasn't simply left where it fell, it had been moved, hidden away in a manner that didn't match a moment frozen in shock. Magazines were discovered knocked under the bed, as if displaced during movement or repositioning. In the kitchen, alcohol had been poured out into the sink, an action that suggested awareness, perhaps even an attempt to alter perception. Individually, each detail might have been explainable. But together, they told a different story. They suggested that the scene had been touched after the fact. Adjusted. Not preserved in the raw, chaotic state one might expect after a genuine accident. And that possibility, of tampering, shifted the entire direction of the investigation. But the apartment itself wasn't the only source of information. As detectives began speaking with people who knew Danielle, a broader picture started to emerge. Friends and co-workers described a relationship that wasn't as stable as it may have appeared on the outside. There were reports of arguments, not just occasional disagreements, but ongoing tension.
You were involved.
Descriptions of controlling behavior surfaced, echoing patterns that had been quietly noticed before but perhaps never fully understood. More concerning were the mentions of injuries. Small things Danielle had tried to explain away. Marks she had chosen not to draw attention to. In isolation, they might not have raised alarms. But in the context of everything else, they began to feel significant, like pieces of a larger pattern that had been building over time. And then there was one detail that stood out sharply. On the day of the shooting, Skylar had been drinking heavily. Alcohol, in situations already marked by tension, can act as an accelerant. It lowers inhibitions, distorts judgment, and can turn underlying conflict into immediate action. It doesn't create intent, but it can strip away restraint. For investigators, that mattered. Because when you combine a shifting story, physical evidence suggesting possible tampering, a history of control and conflict, and the presence of alcohol, the idea of a simple accident becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. What started as a tragic explanation began to fracture under scrutiny. And in its place, a far more complex question took hold. Was this really an accident? Or was it something else entirely, something shaped by emotion, control, and a moment that crossed a line from which there was no return? That question would come to define everything that followed. As the investigation moved deeper, the focus shifted from what was said, to what the evidence revealed. And in this case, the evidence told a story that was far more precise, and far more troubling, than any explanation given. The autopsy was the first major turning point. Danielle Nemitz had been shot directly in the back of the head. Not from across the room. Not at an angle that suggested movement or struggle. It was close range, controlled, deliberate in its positioning. Investigators would later describe it in stark terms, execution style. A description that immediately conflicted with the idea of an accidental discharge. Because accidents rarely look like that. Then came the ballistics analysis. The rifle involved wasn't a weapon that could fire from a light touch or a simple slip. It required significant, deliberate pressure on the trigger. This wasn't a hair-trigger mechanism. It demanded intent, or at the very least, a conscious action. The claim that it had just gone off became harder to reconcile with the mechanical reality of the firearm itself. And the deeper investigators looked, the more the physical evidence began to contradict the narrative. Inside the apartment, forensic analysis revealed movement after the shooting. Blood patterns told a quiet but critical story. One that suggested Skylar Nemitz had not remained still, not frozen in shock, but had moved around before calling for help. The scene wasn't preserved in the raw immediacy of a tragedy. It had been altered, even if subtly. That detail mattered more than it seemed. Because genuine accidents often leave behind chaos, but untouched chaos. Here, there were signs of intervention. Of actions taken after the moment that changed everything. Then there were the injuries on Skylar himself. Cuts on his hands, small, but significant. Investigators believed they were consistent with handling the weapon in a way that placed his finger directly on the trigger. Not brushing against it.
Look,
not near it.
Gonna go away.
On it.
We know you were involved.
That detail narrowed the margin for error even further. When confronted with this growing body of evidence, Skylar's explanations continued to evolve. The certainty of his earlier statements gave way to something less stable. Now, he claimed confusion. He suggested he believed the rifle wasn't loaded. That he had been just playing with it, handling it casually without understanding the risk. But each new version created new problems. If he thought the gun was unloaded, why was it pointed so precisely? If it was casual handling, how did it result in a direct shot to the back of her head? If it was an accident, why did the scene suggest movement and possible tampering afterward? These weren't isolated contradictions. They formed a pattern. And patterns, in investigations like this, are often more revealing than any single piece of evidence. Because while one inconsistency might be explained, multiple inconsistencies begin to point somewhere specific. Toward intent. Not necessarily a long, premeditated plan, but something beyond simple negligence. Something that involved a moment of awareness. A decision, however brief. An action that required more than just carelessness. By this stage, investigators were no longer asking whether a gun had gone off accidentally. They were asking something far more direct. Was this truly a mistake, or was it a moment where control, emotion, and opportunity aligned in a way that led to something intentional? Because the evidence, quiet, precise, and unchanging, was beginning to suggest that this wasn't just about negligence. It was about crossing a line. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the story of Danielle Nemitz was no longer just about a single moment, it had become a layered narrative of what came before, what happened, and how it should be understood. The facts were laid out, but their meaning was still being debated. And in that space between evidence and interpretation, two very different versions of the truth began to take shape. Prosecutors approached the case by building a foundation that stretched beyond the night of October 16. They focused on patterns, on what they argued was a history of control and jealousy within the relationship. Testimony from those who knew Danielle described a gradual shift in her behavior, a quiet withdrawal that suggested something deeper was happening behind closed doors. This wasn't presented as proof of violence in itself, but as context, something that gave meaning to the final act. Then they turned to the physical evidence. The autopsy findings. The trajectory of the bullet. The close-range nature of the shot. The ballistics showing that the rifle required deliberate pressure to fire. Each piece stood in direct contrast to Skylar Nemitz's claim of an accident. Investigators had also documented movement within the apartment after the shooting, details that suggested the scene had not remained untouched. And perhaps most damaging of all, his own words, shifting, evolving, contradicting themselves under scrutiny. For the prosecution, this wasn't a tragic mistake. It was an act that, whether planned in advance or not, involved a level of intent that could not be ignored. But the defense saw it differently. They didn't dispute that Skylar's actions caused Danielle's death. Instead, they focused on what they argued was missing, a clear motive. There was no financial gain, no documented plan, no evidence that he had set out that day intending to kill his wife.
This isn't going to go away.
They pointed to his emotional state after the shooting, his distress, his confusion, as signs of someone overwhelmed, not calculated. According to them, this was not murder. It was a breakdown. A moment of reckless handling of a firearm, compounded by poor judgment and emotional instability. They argued that Skylar was not a violent man by nature, that what happened was not consistent with a deliberate act, but rather a tragic convergence of factors that spiraled out of control. And so, the case came down to a single, defining question. Was this intentional, or was it reckless negligence? It's a question that doesn't always have a clear boundary. Intent exists in a gray area, something that must be inferred from actions, from evidence, from what makes sense when everything is placed together. And in this case, the jury had to weigh not just what happened, but how to interpret it. Their verdict reflected that complexity. Skylar Nemitz was found guilty of first-degree manslaughter. But not guilty of intentional murder. That distinction carries weight. It means the jury believed his actions directly caused Danielle's death. There was no doubt about responsibility. But they were not convinced, beyond a reasonable doubt, that he had intended to kill her in that moment. Instead, they concluded that his behavior was reckless, dangerously so, and that recklessness led to an irreversible outcome. The sentence followed, 13 years in prison, with a minimum of 10 years before he would be eligible for parole. For some, it was a balanced decision, one that acknowledged both the evidence and the uncertainty surrounding intent. For others, it left a lingering discomfort. Because regardless of how the law defines it, the result remains the same: a young woman lost her life in a moment that should never have happened. And that's where the case leaves us, not just with a verdict, but with a question that continues to echo. Because when you look back, at the early signs, the subtle changes, the reports of control and isolation, it's difficult not to wonder whether something could have been done sooner. Could someone have recognized the pattern? Could intervention have changed the outcome? Or are these the kinds of signs that only become clear in hindsight, when it's already too late? There's no simple answer. But the question remains. If those warning signs had been taken seriously earlier, could Danielle still be alive today?